I am absolutely delighted today to be able to introduce Zeena. And I think, both of us had a few chats prior to this conversation, really excited to share and exchange views on DEI and why it's so important. So I think before jumping in, Zeena, you have such a fascinating background. Was wondering if you could kind of take us through and take a step back and share a little bit more about your background and your experiences.
For sure. Thanks, Maria. Let's see. I started my career as an artist, as a music artist. Thought to myself, I will never work a day job a day in my life, and here I am. But it's been a blessing the whole way through. Really started my career at record labels. I worked in rock music, worked in hip hop, worked at an agency doing a lot of brand integration work, which actually brought me to my career as I'm here today. Have been on-air talent. Have produced my own podcasts, web shows. Basically, I lived in New York City and I did anything to make money, as most people know. I'll say that at the beginning of my music career, and as I cruise into marketing and PR and all the different areas that I encompass, I recognized very quickly that there weren't a lot of people who looked like me in those areas. And I found it very important as I started to mature in my career to give back to not only just my employees, but communities around me and make myself available for advice, which actually led me to Asian American Collective, which I started in 2020 with 2 other Asian American women. I'm Filipino. My partners are both Korean. We all had, put in a good 10, 15 years into our career and realized we want to create a community for people who look like us to feel it's okay to go into a career that's completely different than maybe your parents want, or your family has traditionally been accustomed to. So I've been doing a lot of mentorship work, advocacy work, and just helping to bring community moments in New York and LA and nationally when we can. We show up at different key events and really have just built from the ground up on that side. I'm at the North Face full time. I head up all of our brand digital, and I feel blessed to be at the helm of a platform that almost every consumer sees in a real and meaningful way. When you're looking at social channels and you're looking at digital channels, you're looking at the closest and most slight but impactful touch points that a consumer, is viewing for any brand's ethos or anything that the brand is trying to convey. So really, that's what we do. We, have spent a lot of time gutting the way that our social presence shows up, really focusing on DEI, also just focusing on making content more compelling for Gen Z, dipping a toe into new digital spaces, gaming, and all these other places that are popping up in the Web3 world, and also content creators. And I feel when you're talking about DEI, right, content creators are such a legitimate, authentic, key way to really express what any brand is looking for and really help to bring that to life and do it in a legitimate way that feels very, very authentic. So that's how I ended up where I am today, a lover of all things lifestyle and culture. What about you, Maria? Yeah. You have such a crazy past as well.
Yeah, so thank you, Zeena. Thank you. So currently, I'm the director of Google Cloud Fashion and Beauty. And so what that means, or the way that I explained to my mom, is that essentially we work with some of the largest global brands to help them use our technology to help them reach transformative goals. It could be anything from how do you redesign your supply chains using technology to have completely localized assortments, or how do you super tailor your search to have better results. So that's what I'm doing today. In terms of my background, I as well had a path where I was one potentially of not so many women. So I worked in finance and M&A and banking, worked in consulting, financial again for a while, economic think tank. I worked at Gucci for a number of years. I was one of the youngest general managers of a number of different countries. So I ran Northern Europe and then ended up my way at Google. And I think, similarly to you, Zeena, I think what I saw, to your point, content, I think that's super pertinent. I think that all of marketeers, they have a responsibility and they also have the potential to help shape and ensure that there is diversity out there, not only within their own teams, but also what content is fostered and circulated. So I think that's 100% agree with you there. Similar to you, I think for me, one of the reasons I'm delighted to have this conversation with you is because I do think that having diverse teams build much better outcomes for everyone. I think diversity helps lift us all up and find much better solutions. And also as a mom of 3 young kids, 2 little boys and 1 little girl, it's my hope that, again, conversations like these and the important efforts, that you're doing helps ensure that everyone has the right to dream and to do whatever they want to do and be allies to others. So I think, yeah, I think both of us feel that diversity is quite important, diversity and inclusion. I guess on that note, throughout your career, you've had many different experiences that you've shared. Would love to better understand from your perspective, maybe some examples, like why do you believe so strongly that diversity drives better outcomes? And what does that actually mean in practice?
I think it's tried and true, right, in all the work that I've done. And it's interesting because I've been on all different sides of the spectrum, as you had mentioned before, right? I've been one of the only women. I've been one of the only women of color. I've been the only person of color, right, in any instance. And I think one of the things that keeps bubbling up, especially as we've kind of cruised along over the last year and a half of like more hyper awareness and what DEI work means for an organization. And a lot of organizations actually putting their money where their mouth is and creating the right infrastructure, financial obligations to at least like buoy up the work, because the work doesn't happen without the commitment of money. And I think that that's one thing we see that's tried and true. But I'm extremely passionate about elevating people of color to leadership positions. I think without it, not just think, I have seen without people in leadership prioritizing those DEI goals, there is no way that you're going to get the same outcome. You're going to have a difference in perception internally as well, because if you're hiring more like diverse middle management and coordinator level people, they're going to have an expectation of an organization to help to elevate what is just table stakes at this point. And if you don't have people kind of running that up along the chain and financially prioritizing it and prioritizing from a bandwidth standpoint and always constantly kind of embedding into conversations about larger campaigns, it becomes a secondary mission. And that's why getting people and diverse sets of people in leadership positions is a critical piece of this. And I just think that it really starts with you, right? A lot of people feel very overwhelmed by this work. And one of those things that kind of bubbled up, I think, over, Black Lives Matter and some of these other pieces starting to come into play, was that people had an expectation of companies to do things for them in order to like make this big change. But myself even had to come to the realization that the power is actually in our hands to make those changes. And with each of those changes that happens, it's a domino and ripple effect. And it helps to actually bring the larger conversation to the fold with those people, with those diverse perspectives in those leadership positions. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I have one follow-up question because I think this is something that's super interesting. In terms of some of the initiatives, what are the ones that you've seen work the most? As you said, like it needs financial resources, it needs focus, it needs people in leadership positions. What are some examples of things that you think have worked really well that you've seen throughout your career?
Ooh, that's a good one. I think taking, allowing space and bandwidth within positions to follow your part and passion for things that are values-based, right? Even outside of what I'm doing, the North Face, I used to work in the music industry. Now, I'll be real, the music industry does not necessarily have the highest moral compass, but we tried to be very interactive in spaces that made sense for us, and voting rights, making sure that we were kind of getting into the mix of those things, anything that's like nonpartisan, a big cue there. And I think allowing people to feel empowered to have the time to do those things as part of their day job, but also like compensating and offering additional benefits when they are putting that extra work in is critical, because people are working to feel good, right? They want to feel accomplished. They want to feel like they're doing the right thing. And if an organization doesn't give people that time or that respect or space, especially as a manager, you have to allow people to do those things. Then they're going to start, it's going to erode their affinity for the way that the brand or the company is showing up. So I think that that's critical. I also think that it's really important to offer educational resources in order for people to explore any of those points they're passionate about. Like if I want to go to a workshop to understand more about DEI or, spend 3 days on a retreat, you should have some flexibility or understanding within that, to either give people the time off, provide some yearly resources to do so. It's part of your professional development. And I think that I've seen the most success when people feel and understand that existentially it makes them a better worker, and it also makes them a better human, right? So those things are intrinsically connected. And in order for it to have the most impact, you need to connect them together.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I think a couple of things that you said really resonated, like allowing people to explore it in the way that feels most authentic to them and learn and educate themselves, but also organizations making space, putting action against it, and prioritizing it.
Totally.
I think you need both. That's what I've heard you say.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and I think to your point, the question you asked me before, what does this look like in practice, or what does this feel to me? I think having different vantage points, as you mentioned, is incredibly important. I also think seeing people in senior positions that are diverse, that are different than others, are also important as a signal. It's also important, though, for everyone to take part in terms of diversity, to help sponsor, to promote ideas, and also to be inclusive, because you have lots of people at the table and you can recruit lots of candidates who have, whether it's neurodiversity or in terms of gender or racial backgrounds. But if they don't have a seat at the table and they don't feel comfortable and they don't feel like they can make a contribution, then I think that isn't progress as well. So I think that some of the things you say, 100% agree, making the time, making the space. It sounds like it's about focus, priorities, and having aligned values, that it's an important value for the company overall, and ensuring that everyone takes accountability for it.
Yeah, I think that the one point that you just mentioned, like having a seat at the table, but being inclusive. I read a Harvard Business Review. I think that we've discussed this in our pre-chat, but that there was an article, basically these two women were talking about this pet to threat theory. And I couldn't agree more. It really hit me. It hit me hard, because I think that when you're a dynamic personality, or you're somebody who can identify changes that need to be made, you come in, like, it's overwhelming, almost like people want that. But I think what we're seeing in practice, and I've, read a lot about people who are like, heads of inclusion, or like these other roles, that there aren't actually the tools in order to make those changes, or don't have the action points within the functional pieces of the business in order to make that happen. And I think that pet to threat theory is super true. Like, you come in and everybody's like, yes, we have this person, we're ready to go. But then when you try to instill those changes, it's uncomfortable. It's really hard. And as humans, it does take additional effort, no matter what spectrum you're on, to look at somebody else's perspective outside of your own. And to your point, it's really just having that ability to kind of like be a true part of the conversation, and having that mutual respect, breaking bread with other people in that way, that helps to make it a better workplace, no matter how diverse the crew is that you have. So I couldn't agree more.
Yeah, Zeena, and I think to your point, I think also, as a leader, what actions can you take to help foster inclusion? Simple things, like simple tricks, I would say, that that people have taught me along the way, that I think is really helpful. So ensuring, if there are people who don't feel comfortable speaking up, just asking everyone to jot down their ideas on Post-it notes, and then sharing and making sure everyone goes around so that everyone has a voice. Being an ally to someone. If you do notice that there's someone who might be, let's say, in a position not of privilege, ensuring that they have a voice, ensuring that you interrupt a meeting and say, hey, haven't heard from Maria recently. Maria, do you have anything to say? So I think there are small ways, to your point. It is really complicated. It's difficult. It's a bit uncomfortable to know exactly what you should be doing, because let's be honest, like, you're aiming for perfection. It's you're setting yourself up for failure. It's about effort, and it's about trying to take action to help others feel included. And that is, I think, a bit uncomfortable, and it's a bit of experimentation, but it's super important. I guess, how, as an individual and as an organization, how have you seen people move from, as you mentioned, really important principles and cultures of practice and ideas that diversity and inclusion is important, but how does it actually become part of that culture, from, to your point, from leaders and throughout the organization?
Well, it's checks and balances across the way, right? I also think that, like, a lot of internal work needs to happen. And I'll definitely give it to our company. We've spent the last 2 years, when everything started to kind of come to light, and even prior to, because we have a nonprofit organization called the Explore Fund that has been doing equity work in the outdoors for quite some time. And we've always been a values driven brand. But I think a lot of companies have kind of been flipped on their head, right? To have to outline publicly and very quickly a lot of these methodologies to help solve problems that have taken years to actually materialize, right? So that's a lot of pressure for people. I think that a big way is first looking at your staff and the people who are making it their staff, right? Looking at where there's gaps, looking at where you might be lacking in some diversity training. Also, like, in general, making sure that there's a pipeline to advanced those marginalized people within your staff. And that varies, right? Like you go to tech companies and I'm Asian American. Asian Americans are dominant in some of the tech companies. So it's an interesting kind of like assessment individually of where your organization is at, especially combating, we've had the craziest few years, right? The attrition and, just employee retention and all those pieces, but delivering at the base level, at the employment level, equitable pay, equitable resources, development resources, and using that as at least the anchor and the roots for how your tree of DEI kind of grows out. So keeping that in line, I think, is really important. Really looking at ERGs as a great resource to help build and foster community with other people who are working within staff. I can't say enough, again, how important ERGs are, but they require time. And they require management across the board, giving people time to commit to that, or giving people financial compensation, right? I think a lot of companies are really taking this, either a really like proactive approach to paying employees for putting in that time, because it is bandwidth, it's emotional bandwidth in a way that people don't realize. And I think like it's essential for you to feel included in a workplace. And then also from the outside, allowing people to be values driven in the work that they're doing every single day, right? And this is like, again, empowering your budgets, empowering your casting choices, empowering an opinion, to your point. Like, hey, I haven't heard from you. What do you think of this, right? It's going to people that you may not necessarily need feedback from, but you would want a cultural kind of reference from. And the one thing I will say as a watch out there is I feel a lot has been put on people of color over the last years to be the voice of. And that's also something that people need to be very careful of and tread lightly with, because not everybody wants to do that. And it's exhausting emotionally, right? Not only are you doing the work, but then you're scoping the work, and then you have your own work to finish on top of that. So I think that's a consideration that needs to be put into place, but allowing people the autonomy to invest in that DEI in the way that they feel brings the best impact, I think, is extremely important.
So Zeena, you said tons of things that are incredibly interesting. One thing I just want to call out a comment that came across, and it echoed some of the things that you said. Not including is excluding. So I think that really resonated immensely.
Totally.
Secondly, which you've said a number of times, like it takes time, it takes budget, it's priority. It's as important, it sounds like, as any line item. So it has to be actionable and something that's well funded, something that the company agrees with from a higher level. The third thing that you said, which I think was really interesting as well, is, and would love to hear your views on this. It's really exhausting for people who are in this position to continue to be the voices and the advocates. How would you recommend that others that are potentially in more of a privileged group start taking some of that burden off and start putting more of it on themselves? And then I have a couple of questions that have been coming across that I'll move to.
Yeah. I think that's a great question, right? I think that I don't want to speak for the BIPOC community, but it's been really encouraging to see allyship amongst all communities, right? And it goes way far and beyond just being BIPOC. There's a lot of diversity, equity, and inclusion goals that lay way outside of just different intersectional communities, right? We have the disabled community, you have the queer community, you have so many different spaces in between. Inclusive sizing is one thing that we think of all the time, right? Because it goes far beyond just like gender. It goes into many different categories. So like inclusion is always thinking through a cohesive lens, right? And thinking about different viewpoints and the way they're kind of tackled. But I would say it's really important to focus on what matters at any given moment, and making sure that you're kind of like, that you're allowing the space and ability for people to feel openly, speak openly in a circle of trust, and also admit when they maybe need some educational help, right? And I think that ally communities can really help for any of these communities that need a little bit of additional support by listening, by bringing whatever power they can and resources they can to help move towards a more inclusive future, and also by really putting in the time to educate and really thinking a little bit outside of the box. I'm a Democrat, and I spent a lot of time checking out right-wing propaganda and pieces because I want to know why people feel the way they do, right? We don't always necessarily have to agree, but when you're a business person and somebody trying to kind of cohesively bring all of these different things together, you have to understand different viewpoints. And it doesn't mean there's any extremes on either side. It's really understanding how we can find the most common ground to bring it together. So that educational and proactivity point just goes such a long way for so many people.
Yeah, and Zeena, I think you mentioned a couple of things that people can do quite easily and doesn't have to take a systematic change from a company, though it is important that companies focus, as you mentioned, on leadership positions, ensuring that they commit the right time and resources, but education. For instance, you mentioned reading something that has a different point of view, or even, I know at Google, we have numbers of talks about people from different backgrounds, just being curious, listening their perspective. Couple of things that we've seen or that has been personally helpful that I've seen with some of the people that within my organization, also with myself, is taking the time to sponsor someone who doesn't come from a privileged background and making every effort to help ensure that not only their voice is heard, but they do progress to leadership positions because they are talented and because they deserve. But being intentional about it, calling out behavior, making sure people at meetings are able to speak, making tangible goals. You mentioned this as well. There's lots of goals and commitments. I think to your point, the more visible companies can be around, yeah, maybe we're not perfect 100%, but we're making progress, or maybe we're falling behind. But that radical transparency, I think, is something that we're seeing much more of. And I think that's good because it makes us just that much more accountable. And so whether it's individual goals or company goals, that measurement and tracking is something, again, like what could you do? Even if it's just yourself, I make a goal or commitment to read one book about X every month. That's progress and that's education. What are your thoughts on that? Are there any other great articles that you've read or things that you would keep in mind?
Yeah. And I would say that the intentionality is a really great call out, right? I think sponsorship, as you mentioned, is a huge one, and people are craving that. I try to do that in my life here and just in general. And I think as you start to elevate and you become a person who's like more influential within an organization, that can be critical to somebody's career. I've only gotten where I am through sponsorship from others as well. So that paying it forward, I think, as a leader is such an incredible way to actually do that. The other thing I was going to actually say before is, as a leader, especially somebody who's probably a little different than most, right? I've tried to spend a lot of my time in the past year showing up as my full self and who I am now. And we're all a work in progress, right? We're all completely lost until we're found, and we're trying to find what that next stage of our life looks like, no matter what stage you're at.
And the messiness is great, Zeena. We're all messy, right? Messiness is great.
We all don't know what we're doing at some point in time, right? But I really try to show up a little bit more as my cohesive self. I think at other times in my career, I've hid a bit of who I actually am. And I'm at a wonderful time where I'm refining those pieces in real time and helping to bring them together to be this new metamorphosis of like who I am next. And I think it's really important to show up as who you really are, especially as a person of color, because we do just as amazing work. If not, we have an incredible different foresight into other different spaces that people may not inherently be part of, right? And suppressing those pieces of yourself will not make you happy as an employee and will not bring you fulfillment within your career as well. So I encourage anybody that I meet that's, hey, got like a little bit of a different spin, like show up as your true self, as long as you're being intentional with what you're doing. And as long as it can resonate from a passion standpoint, I think that that's also such an important piece as well, that a lot of people in general suppress. And that will help you kind of connect a bit more with that DEI work, honestly, because it gives a full expression of how consumers are looking at it. And I think that's just important to do. So when you ask me too about some things that I've been reading or just some things that are helpful, I put a bit of thought of this. I want to encourage, and I'll put it in the chat right now, this Harvard Business Review. I can't say enough how interesting this piece is and how much it's made me think about different parts of my career as a woman and also as a woman of color. Definitely feel that it's a great read. And I've been listening to this podcast recently that may seem a little like why in this conversation, but it's called Second Life, and I'm going to send it in the chat here. And it's hosted by Who What Wears Hillary Kerr, and really talks about how people have, kind of like pivoted their careers. And it's absolutely the most random mix of people in the world, from like Dasha Polano, I can't even say her name, who is an Orange is the New Black, used to be a healthcare provider in New York City, and kind of talks about the challenges that people may have, or the preconceived notions of their life that people may have coming from different marginalized backgrounds or different backgrounds, and how they've taken that and pivoted into the business world in a completely different way, and either use that to help kind of fulfill some like other more values driven goals that they wanted, or artistic goals that they had. So I just think that it helps to understand how people's lives have formed and shaped. And it helps to give you a little perspective of not only yourself, but the people who you're working with, and also your target consumers and people in other spaces as well. What about you?
Yeah. So Zeena, I'm sorry, I have questions coming across. I've got to
no
answer.
worries.
But this is really great. I think question we have from the audience. Do you think an important part of DEI is investing in community micro-influencers versus celebrity ambassadors? How do you think about that balance within your organization?
I don't think it's a either or. I think you need both, right? Like it's very specific to a campaign. I've spent a lot of time investing in creators in a real way, and using my budget, pivoting my budget to substantiate the kind of creators that we're using for TikTok, for instance. And I think it's extremely important to connect with those audiences. And that's the beauty that TikTok has given us, right? That you can connect with real people who are also making their money off of creating videos for the world. And I think it is really important to invest in those people. I mean, it's great to have some high level talent that you align with on some brand campaigns, but I think utilizing and paying your creators what they deserve across the board in different, in different subsets is extremely useful as a tool. And also helps to meet some of those goals, because you're really allowing them to be the mouthpiece through their lens and their lived experiences for whatever it is that you're trying to put together for your brand.
Yeah, and Zeena, we've seen the same thing also within some of our video platforms. The more authentic you are, particularly today, given the pandemic, the more real people are speaking to people about real problems. It just resonates more, and so that's the beauty of having these platforms for us: YouTube, TikTok, and others. Other quick comment, because we're coming close to time, but I'm going to leave with one last question. But a great comment from Lucy. Being resilient is important. Yes, Zeena, you've shown resilience, it sounds like, in spades. I think another point that you asked me, what else kind of learning? There's these great pieces. I think vulnerability. I think there's, the imposter syndrome. Yeah, I've read that. There's another article, I'll try to see if I can find it, about what it means as a leader to be vulnerable, to share yourself, to share your experience, to not have perfection, to experiment. I think that's one other thing that has a lot of resonance with this issue of DEI, and making sure that the organization embraces it. I think as leaders, we have a huge responsibility. And one easy thing to do is just ensure that when you're recruiting for the pipeline, that you make sure it's diverse and evaluate those candidates and insist on it. Insist on it from HR. Like, I will not finish filling this position, even if it takes me 2 more months, until I have a diverse, however you define diverse, because I think there was a question about that as well, diverse candidate pool, and insist on that and put down your foot.
That's so key, what you're saying right there. Like, we can all just have a position and wait for HR to send us some candidates, but that's not actually how you get the best talent. And being intentional in the way that you're recruiting, because I do see from Ty kind of like some questions about that. You have to be intentional, and you have to think about the groups that might have the candidates you want, right? Like, does your organization have an HBCU pipeline, right? Does your organization kind of go out to other networks or job networks that are more granular within specific communities, like the one that I run, Asian American Collective? Tons of people send us job referrals or potential jobs for other people that we use within our closed pipeline, right? So it's really building that muscle to have communications with these kind of groups to get the most diverse slate of talent. And it's work. It's real work. And it's a work that actually will pay off long-term if you're patient and do it.
Yeah, and I think, to your point, Zeena, probably take more time, and might take more time, but then you find better candidates, you have more diverse opinions, and then you have, at the end of the day, better teams. So last question for you, Zeena. If you had to leave this audience with either one reflection, an insight that you had throughout your career, or one advice, what would it be?
Lead
If
from
they
the
want
heart.
to take action on this.
Yeah. I would say lead from the heart and make it really your purpose, because it goes into every tentacle of your life, but also be intentional with your work every single day. If you see something that's obviously not right, say something. Definitely feel that your opinion is valued. And if you're not in an organization where you can evangelize that opinion, then you're probably not in the right place. You want, taking the power to do that work every single day is just so critical in whatever way that you can, to really pushing, DEI forward as a whole. We're all learning together. It takes these little steps, and don't think that you're not doing enough, because honestly, again, every little step counts.
That's great. Thank you so much, Zeena, for this conversation. It was an absolute delight to speak with you.
Thank you. And I did put those in the chat, so I don't know if you guys can like grab that. Definitely just want to make sure that you guys get those readings and that podcast.